Picking up some ambient noise there from a garbage truck or something.
Indeed, it's right outside my window.
Okay.
Across it, it should be done soon.
Well, so we're live. So this is episode 8. Let me just close that up. There we go. So we don't have a guest this time. Um, Let me just ask really quick. Are you watching this? Because I think I'm getting some echo.
No,
Okay, maybe it's just me.
I'm not picking up anything.
All right, I won't worry about it. I'm sure it'll go away.
Uh huh.
Approach most problems. So this is episode 8. We're we don't have a guest this time, so we're going to be sort of articulating what we've done and what we need to do. Let me see. I'm going to try sharing my screen through Skype with you.
Okay. We are. We're working on some guests. Emails and email invites have been sent. So.
Can you? And are you seeing my screen?
I am.
Okay. Can you say who you've invited, or is that not appropriate at this point?
I don't know.
Okay.
Actually.
No, it's probably not then.
Yeah. In case. Yeah. I don't know. I don't now. Now that I'm to the moment, I'm like, I don't know. If
But
we've invited someone and have not heard back, if naming them in the interim
yeah,
puts undue pressure or not, I don't
yeah,
know.
probably not. Usually, in most situations, nothing is the best answer.
Exactly.
So we've got some tabs out there for upcoming guests. We can maybe just say what these guests the subject area they may be able to talk to us about.
Yeah. So the ones I've been looking at is kind of it by virtue of sort of the order in which guests have coming on. Kind of we've had a nice sort of sequence where we talked to Casey Boyle about cultural techniques, and then Kathleen Fitzpatrick, right,
Mm-hmm.
about collaboration, and then
Amy Evans. Mm-hmm.
yes, about IRB. So kind of hitting all the various facets. Um, so some of the people that I've been looking at would kind of bring us back around to some of the things that we talked to Casey about. So some folks in media theory and things like that, particularly looking at um, social media and going back to kind of some of the conversations we had about Casey and a little bit with Amy about the kind of labor practices of this, right? How have companies figured out a way of extracting value out of people's participation in social networks? And while not explicitly or directly linked to Mechanical Turks, seems to be in the ballpark of, right, how do you take that kind of network where people are engaging in these kind of small micro tasks, in the case of social media, right, viewing a video or talking to people, how do you generate economic value out of that?
Yeah.
And oftentimes one of the ways they discuss that is they actually discuss people's social media practices in terms of labor from which a platform extracts value out of. So I thought that might be right. How does value extracted from that? But then also, how do those platforms then incentivize people to participate in ways that are the most profitable? And so that might also be interesting in terms of as we've looked in sort of the incentive structures that are built into Mechanical Turks, and how does that shape how that work gets understood and valued both by the people that put those tasks out and the people that accomplish do those hits.
Yeah, so I shared this screen. You can see the notes page here. There should be a question mark at the end of that. You can see the notes page here, I'm assuming.
Yes.
So I tried to break this down because one of the things that came out of our conversation with Amy Evans was we were almost certainly focusing too broadly, too many tasks. So, as a follow-up, I contacted Amy about, if we're doing the content analysis of the hits themselves through the method we're using, would that require IRB approval and that sort of thing. And she was pretty confident that if what we're doing is collecting that hit information and then running content analysis on it, that it wouldn't.
Right.
Because that information, although not completely public, is semi-public and would be disidentified. In fact, just really quickly, let me point that out, that we do have that data available publicly, but you can see it's been disidentified by removing the requester category. Let me just pull this one up, I guess.
Yeah, because I remember that was the one that a lot of them were potentially untraceable screen names, but some of them did appear to be either names of companies or appeared to be people's full names.
Yeah, right. And because some of them were just straight up individuals. I mean, one thing about Mechanical Turk is these aren't all, nameless, faceless corporations. Sometimes it's just somebody who needs something, or as we saw in a lot of the research, academics, so sometimes it's just straight up names. So you can see this is the public version. Essentially the way it works is on the back end there's a full version, and then there's a public version, and the public version of this spreadsheet is just drawing information from that full version, and it's not including the requester column. So that's useful, because then there's just no way to see it. I mean, that was something I was kind of concerned about. Apparently, Amy just sort of suggested, she was like, it would be just good policy to remove that. It's not clear if that would constitute a privacy breach. It's just best practices,
Right.
And this, I think, would preserve that, because even if you download a copy of this, there's nothing on it except what we're seeing here is actually data that's being fed in. So all this is really doing is importing data from another spreadsheet. So even if you save a copy and look at it, it's really, there's just a function in there,
Right.
But it also allows us to retain those identifiers, because some of the work we want to do, I think, will depend on at least being able to match up tasks with requesters.
Yeah.
Maybe even categories of requesters, like, business versus individual, or that kind of thing.
Yeah, you can see that being potentially useful, not useful, meaningful in some way, yeah.
So that's there, and I bring this up in connection to what you were saying, because that evolved out of probably a recognition with during our conversation with Amy that this is probably multiple works, right?
Yeah.
So if we were looking at, and so I started to kind of parse out here where it says possible paper sequence, or sequence maybe not the best term there, and I don't like using, well, we'll think about it, but
yeah,
the idea,
I don't mind sequence.
Yeah, I guess that assumes a kind of teleology that may be in there and maybe
no.
I don't know.
That's it. Yeah.
So in terms of breaking these into separate works, if we've got the content analysis one, because some of the reading I was doing, because I was thinking, and I don't think we have to resolve this right now, but after the content analysis is completed, or at least we're into it and we start getting a better understanding of the results we're getting, right? Actually, after we actually put all this textual content through analysis and it starts spitting out things that are comprehensible, we'll have to think about things like how to contextualize that in the paper.
Right.
And, I'm wondering, if like the information on cultural techniques, if that would be appropriate there, or the way I was sort of breaking it down here, I was anticipating probably a more terse sort of intro setup for this kind of paper, where it's pointing out here's what Mechanical Turks is and why it would be important to look at the language of that. And
we wouldn't necessarily need something as precise as cultural techniques to do that, right? We're with potentially, right, we need maybe less at that point a fully realized theoretical apparatus than more just a well-defined research question, right?
Yeah.
This paper investigates and shares the result of a content analysis that's looking at the ways in which the human is being articulated through the composition of
Yeah.
these hits.
Yep. And so, bearing that in mind, I mean, I was curious if, and you can kind of see the sequence here, if then we moved on, as we talked with Amy about, to something that would require IRB, and that would be the things where we're actually doing hits with Turkers.
Mm-hmm.
So those could constitute things like surveys, and we may be able to then put surveys in conversation with the content analysis, right? Content analysis says this is what's going on, but Turker surveys say this, right? But there's also the potential for other hits that we have talked about, like particularly ones where we're investigating things like the language of hits themselves from a production angle, right? Where we're seeing where hits succeed and fail based on the language we're choosing.
Right.
So all of those things potentially could be a separate piece, in part just sort of from a structural standpoint, because those kinds of things would require IRB approval.
Yeah.
So potentially that's a step, and this may all lead, and so maybe there is a sequence here, maybe not, but perhaps this leads to a more theoretically driven paper where we're putting what we've discovered about M-Turk, as Casey suggested, in kind of conversation with its analogs or colleagues, I suppose.
Yeah.
Things like Fiverr and Be My Eyes, other things. And, so maybe I'm wondering, is there like a theoretical piece that is its own entity rather than a component of one of these other papers?
I mean, I think that makes sense. And what would be interesting is, I mean, I think at this point, there's a certain sense, I mean, I think actually sequence makes sense, right? That the content analysis really is the first thing, because we can't, to a certain extent, we can't do the second one unless we've got a pretty good sense of how a hit gets composed. And then kind of what we're doing in the second one is then experimenting with the composition of those.
Right.
And then the theory or whatever, that piece would then in part come out of, right, that, because one of the things that we got from Casey, right, is this notion that you're not going to kind of pin down the cultural technique in one spot.
Right.
Right. You're going to kind of feel around the edges of it and see the ways in which it's distributed across things that look more or less related. So in that sense, we can't really articulate it that way unless we've done these first steps that allow us to kind of feel around the edges of it. And then once we got a sense of what we think the technique is here, we can then draw it out even more by then putting it in conversation with other ones that we think are related to it.
Yeah.
So
they're
different.
The same theme.
Yeah, they're different. They're sort of three different, maybe even nested as opposed to sequenced ways of teasing this out.
Right.
But they're all basically three cracks at doing it, and one is a kind of quantitative approach, one's a more qualitative approach, and the other one's more of a theory-driven approach. But they're all kind of getting at the same thing with just. In many ways, you could point out that the difference across these three is the method that we're using. But we're essentially asking the same research question three different ways. One through a kind of content analysis, one through a kind of qualitative experimentation, and then one essentially through the method of theory. Yeah. But it's the same question, three different methods.
So I mean, I was just making some notes about that to see if that would make sense, and then we might also think about how some of our guests could further, one or more of these kind of ends, right? So like the guests you were talking about earlier in terms of, if they're able to comment on things like labor practices, would that fit under, two or bullet 2
right.
or 3, or would that be maybe a separate entity in itself, or but I won't have to answer that right now, but it's something to consider about how to kind of compartmentalize or distribute or whatever that that information.
Yeah. No, and I think the other benefit in sort of the larger ethos of the project is this notion of sort of publicly, collaboratively doing this work. That I wonder if there's a benefit of explicitly stating we're going to try to approach this research question using we're going to try it 3 different times, and so in a sense maybe sequence doesn't work because it looks like it's building, and what these they sort of build on each other, but they're also 3 parallel approaches. So in that sense, thinking about one as quantitative, one as qualitative, and one as theoretical are for lack of a better term, or maybe a good term, right, is it highlights the experimental nature of what we're doing. So in part, what the project that following Mechanical Turks, what we're going to lay out is we've done all this publicly, we've done it collaboratively, and we've also tried the experiment using 3 different methods. And so when we look back in the project as a whole, we've kind of offered, here's 3 different models you could use to answer to explore this kind of question, right? Here's how you could do it quantitatively. Here's how you could do it qualitatively, and then here would be the method of theory.
Yeah. Well, I mean, anyway, that's I think something we can think about in terms of parsing that. I mean, in the meantime, and this is probably important, we're in a sense kind of moving forward with all of them in different ways, right? Because I mean, data collection is always happening on one. I do that, a few times a week. Probably semester break, we'll have enough to start actually firing off some analysis and see what happens. But at the same time, we're undoubtedly picking up elements, from Casey, from readings, from others about, how this may work theoretically.
Yeah.
Picking up stuff about a qualitative approach, certainly nuts and bolts stuff from Amy.
Yeah.
So it's not as though, it's not a sequence in the sense of we focus on one, right? Because when we do 2, they're all kind of proceeding. Really, in a way, this is just part of our larger project of organizing the information we're encountering, right?
Yeah. And then MTurk spins out or spits out 3 different research products, but they're not necessarily sequential. They're emerging at different times, but from the same corpus, or whatever we want to describe it.
Yeah. Anywho, so that's one thing. This was just a side thing. I kind of shot you a text about this because I was thinking about how to introduce the content analysis stuff, and so I was just I didn't want to get too lost in this, but I was reading some work on the Mechanical Turk as a figure, because that's not just a cute metaphor that Amazon selected. Like I was looking at, I think it's either Sharpless or Sharples. I've never heard it pronounced, but his cultural history of chess players. I think it's a Rutledge. Manchester University Press. It's kind of interesting because it makes a fair amount of hay pointing out the connection between, the icons of artificial chess play are the Turk and IBM's Deep Blue, I believe it is. Deep Blue or Big Blue. I think they had both, actually. But one
wasn't Watson.
Yeah, well, and that's what it points out, that Watson wasn't a chess player, but this line of thinking for IBM led to things like Watson. And when IBM discusses them, even when they were talking about the chess playing, I mean, it's most famous with its match with Kasparov or Kasparov.
Yeah. Who I think we discussed it at one point. Who actually, there's that moment where he accused them of cheating.
Yes.
There was a move that Deep Blue made. He was convinced there was a guy inside the box.
Yeah, that it was too human. There's a documentary about this called Game Over, about the match. It's an interesting book because it talks about a lot of what it talks about is the environment, how these things are acts of constructed environments, not only with the Turk, but also the chess match environment. And how it's a construction that leads to particular things. it's an interesting text. I didn't want to spin off too much because you got to keep a little bit focused, but it makes a lot of hay. And then precisely that, Nathaniel, that Watson's job went on to be things like trying to develop pharmaceuticals and identifying cancer patterns. It's had kind of mixed success doing that. But
Yeah.
the dream was that it would be able to aggregate all this data. I mean, Jeopardy was just its proving ground. Its job was to, kind of the dream of big data, that you get enough information and it could point out things, in cancer that humans, just couldn't keep it all in mind.
Right.
And it could say, it could invent novel techniques. It's done some things with cooking and pharmaceuticals and that kind of thing. But, again, and actually Ricky Jay talks about this, and who's not an academic, but a keen historian of, I don't know what you call it, magical performance, I guess. Who was, recently died, but was a very well respected, long practicing magician, but also, student of those forms of persuasion.
Yeah.
And in his piece, he kind of points, he riffs a little bit on, how is it fake? Is the Turk fake? Particularly
Right.
when we notice things like it in a lot of ways led to the construction of the automated loom.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first examples of automated labor, tapping directly into Amazon's mechanical Turk.
Yeah.
The mechanical loom is this watershed of taking human, semi-skilled human labor and replacing it with a machine. And, it's pretty explicit that one of the drivers of that was the chess-playing Turk.
Yeah.
Charles Babbage also, the one of the progenitors of the contemporary digital computer, although it wasn't digital at that time, was also familiar with the Turk. And, there is that article. In fact, I think we have it, right? When Babbage played the...
Or met it, yeah, because Tom Standage talks about that he's got a book about the mechanical Turk, and he runs through a litany of people who came into contact with it, and then traces their subsequent trajectory after sort of encountering the Turk. Like Edgar Allan Poe wrote a piece where he tried to figure out how it worked, and a lot of people in literary studies credit that original article with his invention of the detective story. So
yeah, this
yes.
is what I was thinking of.
Yeah. Okay.
When Charles Babbage played chess with the original mechanical Turk. And I mean, whether or not that, you can make a direct line of, well, then this is, the first computer. I mean, that's debatable, but clearly it was in the milieu. And
right.
These connections are more than just a cute term for something. It's like, yeah, the Turk had this direct connection to things, like our notion of automated labor today, like the computer. I mean, it was certainly certainly part of this story.
Yeah, and the obsession at that point with automatons generally.
Right.
Right. Used as and all the subsequent techniques. There's certain kinds of, I think, rubber that were invented because someone was trying to, maybe the guy that did the mechanical Turk, but making the duck, the bird that would eat something and digest it and then
poop it out. Yeah.
Poop it out. In part, like some of these were experiments to figure out how these things worked. And so a lot of the people that did the automatons were mechanical engineers, but also, the kind of polymaths.
Right.
And they would invent a whole bunch of techniques and technologies in order to get the automatons to work that they were building to curry favor at court and get patrons so they could then go do their scientific work.
And I think that's something that Jay actually does a good job with because was a magician and performer. There wasn't those clean lines between real science and performance,
Yeah.
The guy who did the Turk, I don't know how to pronounce it. I think it's Kempelen or Kempelen.
Yeah.
He certainly was aware of this because he saw, he made modifications to the steam engine, and he saw some of his work as, more meaningful or having a sort of better impact on humanity, because he did eventually sell the Turk as sort of like, well, I'm kind of done
Yeah.
with this. And
I'm done taking this thing on the road.
but the lines, I mean, that's why the notion of fake, and I mean, as Amazon says, artificial intelligence, I think there's a line in one of these texts where it says, is it fake if it led to the creation of the, I mean, what are you calling
Yeah.
fake here?
Yeah. Where does the line get drawn?
So
And in many ways, yeah, and where that's happening, again, that's for us, it's interesting, is there's
Yeah.
major blurring happening between, in many ways, right, the difference between fake and real is going to be some rough parsing of human versus non-human autonomy,
Yeah.
which is precisely the thing that's potentially increasingly difficult to parse.
Yeah.
Although Mechanical Turk points out that maybe historically difficult to parse too.
Yeah, and I mean that was in this book, the chess playing one, kind of suggests that it says, even at the time, it was largely widespread understood to be a kind of performance, right? I mean, very few people actually thought, "Ooh, that's a machine that's able to do this." A lot of it was, how is it able to do this, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
the same kind of questions we ask of magic tricks. We know it's not magic, but it's still like, how is that happening? I mean, there's
Yeah.
and
Something happened.
Yeah.
A real thing occurred.
and in some ways, it's like the thing. In many ways, is it's like that's more dramatic than magic. Magic would be an easier solution to explain
Right.
whatever the heck is going on here than the complexity and the practice that has to go into something like this. So I mean, I was kind of looking at this because in thinking of setting up, what's going on in the Turk, I was maybe going to pull in some of this just brief information about, these overlaps between human and non are meaningful and kind of historical here. This notion of falsehood. And as you say, I mean, its connection to, but where's the human doing this, right? When we
Right.
say fake, what we mean is, but there's some guy pulling strings somewhere.
Right. Yeah. Weirdly enough, this is a hoax because the human being behind it makes it the hoax.
Right.
So the
that's
hoax,
relevant.
identifying it as a hoax becomes a way of reifying the uniqueness of human agency.
Right. Yeah.
There's a weird kind of humanist comfort in revealing something as a hoax because it removes the possibility that something weird is happening. Now it was just like it was a guy the whole time in the
Right.
box.
It's like pulling off the mask at the end of Scooby-Doo, right? There aren't really any monsters. It's always Old Man Withers, right? And
Yes.
this book has a couple of chapters that are explicitly about the Gothic, and about the horror of precisely the horror of the automaton, right? I mean, that its
Yeah.
ending of humanity is a Gothic encounter that taps
Yeah,
into its environmental stuff.
Yeah, I wonder if there's any faint connections to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein too.
Yeah, it talks about that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know off the top of my head if those would be literal connections, dude. But I mean, certainly it's there. The notion of the built thing.
Yeah, a lot of threads, a lot of ins and outs. No, I just did, and probably now's a good time to introduce it. I was listening to a comedy podcast, but they had a band on, and it's a LA-based pop music band called Yacht. I was not familiar with them.
The Boat
But-
or YOT?
Yacht, like the boat,
Okay.
in all caps. But their most recent album that's coming out at the end of the month, they used various algorithms to both generate the melodies and to generate the album title. But it's clearly right. They would feed the algorithm like all the lyrics. They would feed, but they would experiment with different algorithms, and then they would then create like a top 10 list, and then they would pick the ones that they wanted. But what's interesting about it is that they didn't just use one; they experimented with different kinds of algorithms to get what they would get. And so some of the melodies and some of the titles, so I've not looked into it much, but this jumped me again as that kind of it sort of human intelligence task, right? That you get the computer to generate all these album titles,
Right.
and then the human intelligence task is going through and sorting the ones that you think are the most appropriate. So again, it's not, they are picking it and they're feeding what goes into the algorithm, and they also essentially tried out different algorithms that would parse the corpus differently. And so it's kind of interesting. Their description of how they came up with the title is similar to a kind of Mechanical Turk kind of, like the Mechanical Turk basically does some of the grunt work, and then the human artist comes in at the end and kind of has the, veto power over what gets done.
Yeah. This is interesting because I'm sure you can see this. The third link here was about a public relations disaster, which appears to be, they announced they'd been victims of a privacy hack and then said it was only a promotional stunt, and fans didn't like that. It relates to what we discussed with Amy Evans about this notion of risk and the role of privacy, right? Fans feel betrayed.
Yeah.
That they were tricked into thinking your privacy was violated, but no, it was fraudulent. There are a lot of threads there about, the private being, the human as a subject that is at risk for having its privacy violated,
Right.
That's what a human is. Someone who needs privacy protections.
Yeah. Yeah, if we talk to Amy about that, what is a human for you? A human is someone who's vulnerable in the context of research that will result in a publication.
Yeah, right.
Other than that, humans don't exist for us.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, that struck me again as maybe thinking of this, the one that the third bullet point that's highlighted there, right? Those kinds of related entity where there's a kind of the technique of dividing up the labor along human or non-human lines, and then how that potentially gets complicated.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's lots of beeps and boops in their music, so it's on point there. And right, not knowing that is it part of their creative process, or given apparently what they've done in the past, is it also then part of the publicity engine, right? That's why I know of this album, because I learned about the ways they did it, and that made me interested in what it is they were doing, which again is kind of the Mechanical Turk being built by someone who's explicitly aware of its showmanship aspects.
Yeah, I'm just making notes here. Just so we don't forget here.
Mm-hmm.
This is, kind of the continual notes wrangling thing. I did add this section here for things like M-Turk that may be aspects of a cultural technique, where some of this was already on the sheet. I just kind of grouped it together.
Yeah.
Some of this kind of Turk-like labor, but that's still done by humans, like phone farms. We talked about Fiverr. This interesting thing came up. It may not be relevant, but it was just there were hitman services on Fiverr.
Lovely.
Well, but it's interesting because of this notion of like curation and how do you control what goes on there, and and what doesn't, right?
Mm-hmm.
I was interested because Fiverr, as it says, seems to kind of want, in some ways, it's kind of an anti-Turk in that it wants individuals with specific individual skills. If the Turk is the big aggregate, Fiverr is almost like, hey, you're someone who can really draw a good band logo.
Right.
I mean, in some ways they're very closely related. In other ways, they do seem to be wanting kind of different things. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that would be right. Is the cultural technique less evident in the kinds of labor that gets done, and more in terms of the platform that organizes the labor?
Yeah.
Because in that way, Fiverr is sort of like Mechanical Turks, right? They want different things, but the model that they're using to assign or apportion that labor appears to be similar. I mean, I was teaching a course right now. It's teaching writing, so it's teaching our incoming graduate students how to teach writing. And this came up last night, we were talking, it's kind of a general introduction. And so one of those was like the labor, the milieu of labor around this. And kind of made the joke that we've, I think, made here is that notion of the gig economy that seems to be more recent in terms of like Uber and Lyft, you could see as actually one of the places it may have come from is higher ed, right? That the notion of the adjunct and contingent labor is weirdly right, that we need a human intelligence task. We need you to come in and teach these specific courses in this specific way for a particular rate, and then you're off. So I'm still thinking about one way to go that just occurred to me is thinking about in our own field, right, the whole discussion of robo-grading.
Yeah.
Right, the notion of we'd rather have, right, the educational ETS would rather have robots do it. I mean, the years when I graded AP exams is now that I'm thinking of it, is weirdly kind of mechanical Turkish, right? The ways in which we were on like a stadium floor, we were normed, and then essentially told you have to grade this many papers today, and the faster that you score them, the more accurate your score will be, because if you slow down, you're going to start evaluating them as a teacher, and we don't want that to happen. So the speed was correlated to the reliability of the score. Yeah. And now looking back, like that strikes me as awfully like a human intelligence task.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that'll be interesting. And you're right, I pulled up this link because this is kind of at the other end of the spectrum, right? So the machines can defeat us in chess. We have them beat at picking berries, right? I mean, this is, in a way, kind of Turk-like labor, but manual, and although I guess, what is the division between picking a berry and clicking a?
I mean, yeah.
But this was sort of about, because we often make those divisions at sort of a higher level. That's what the chess book is sort of about. We see it as this intellectual capacity or a moral or ethical capacity. Even returning to the thing about the band, right? A creative capacity, right?
Right.
The machine can spit these out, but it takes us to know which one is the good one. It can't really tell us.
We can pick the berries because we have the dexterity to, right, the I was going to say supple touch. That seems too risque, but you know what I mean, right? I watched a weird documentary about, it was one of those things like a Discovery Channel where they do these 15-minute, and they did a thing about the machines that they used to pick tomatoes and how hard that was to create something that could pull it off without crushing it. And it turns out the complicated hydraulic system you have to create that does what a human hand just automatically does is incredibly complicated. Yeah. And weighing the costs of that machine versus what's often used is itinerant migrant labor of those things. So
yeah, there was just a post I think yesterday related to that about developing a new hand, a robotic hand that could do that. That it was a soft-bodied hand.
Yeah.
And I think it may have used either hydraulic or inflatable, like Big Hero 6, right? That if it used the pneumatic system for the appendages, for the phalanges, then it looked more like sort of a jellyfish. It had sort of a ball and tentacles that would wrap around and then inflate, so it could, apply pressure but not damage. It was interesting, but I thought that kind of link is interesting because, as we're talking about, we often see the human-non-human division as, a division that puts us in the superior seat,
Right.
We have a capacity, creative, genius capacity, a moral capacity, an ethical capacity that other things just don't have. But we're looking, in a way, at sort of the other end of that spectrum, which is, but we can pick berries. Or
right.
in a way that a machine can't. We can click something in a way that a machine can't, or doesn't.
I like even in the Matrix, right? We're still needed as batteries, right? We can do all the smart stuff. We just need you for your BTUs you put off.
Yeah, originally I read that the original permutation of that in the Matrix, because that battery metaphor doesn't work, because I mean humans take power. That's
Right.
it's never made any sense. They discuss it as they throw it away by saying combined with a form of fusion, and it's
Yeah.
like, yeah, but if you've got that, you don't need
Just
energy
just
sinks.
just use fusion.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's never made sense, and the reason potentially why was in the original drafts of that they were
Hmm.
using networked humans as the computing platform, because the human brain's computing activity is
Ah.
still exponentially, particularly in terms of the energy used, right?
Yeah.
Its energy use and computing ability is just off the charts compared with what we can do with
We're we're
machines.
we're cheaper than a server room.
Cheaper and better, and more
Yeah.
efficient, and so the idea was you just get a bunch of humans together and mesh their brains together essentially and make a distributed computer network. And it's like,
But
oh, that makes so much more
it also
sense.
makes the Matrix make more sense, right? So
Yes.
how do we keep the brain active and working? We
Yeah.
give it we
A simulation. Uh-oh, I think we just had a blip in the Matrix here. Let me see if I can call him back. I guess we're getting too close. I think they're onto us. Well, let's see. All right. Okay, I think they're onto us. We know too much now.
Yeah, no. My other device cut out on me.
Okay. Well, it's because the Matrix knows.
No, but that would also make the need for the Matrix much more interesting.
Yeah.
Boy,
I know.
that's a bummer.
And apparently, I mean, this is all third-hand, probably made up information, but that part was discarded because it was thought to be too confusing for viewers.
Yeah.
I mean, at that time, it was early '90s, mid '90s.
Maybe. Yeah, I mean that'd have been a tough sell. But
Anywho.
yeah, it's the weird way. What's also what I was going to point out too is what's interesting is what you were describing is the attempt to recreate the human hand.
Yeah.
Is weirdly you do that by doing another animal.
Right.
Right.
It's biomimicry.
The best human hand out there. The best human hand out there is actually a starfish.
Yeah. Yeah. Biomimicry is because as they point out, it's if you look at the natural machine, it's had billions of years to churn out something that does this.
Yeah.
In machine years, we've only had a couple decades, so.
No, I mean evolution is some pretty efficient beta testing.
Right. Well, so anywho, in terms of going forward, with that first the content analysis one, that's proceeding apace. It doesn't necessarily feel like it because a few times a week I'm just collecting data, but it is happening.
Yeah.
And so what I need to do is post methodology. That's been I kind of had to revise that because changed quite a bit, but I need to do that. We do need to talk to the publisher about Manifold. That's been on the to-do for a while.
Yeah, I need to get a hold of Jeff.
Just to see if they can do that. And then guests. So you've got a line on a couple of potential guests, correct?
Yeah, one in the media, and then one that might be potentially useful for the first piece, the content analysis. There's someone that's going to be on campus, and her name escapes me now. So we have a DH center, and she does work in data visualization and things like that. So I was hoping to be able to at least either meet her as I'm going to be involved in some of those events. So if we can't get her, at least being able to meet with her and pick her brain a little bit about possible things to look at in terms of what kinds of not necessarily the workshop you did on crunching the numbers, but thinking about data visualization and how would we think about different ways of sharing this and sort of modeling whatever it is we come up with.
Yeah. No,
right.
I mean, that'd be helpful because R has all kinds of visualization packages, but there is also the difference between useful and cool, right? I mean,
yeah,
it's easy to spit out a word cloud, but is a word cloud useful?
Yeah,
Not
and
always.
her background is in photography and graphic design, so I think that's part of why she's being brought in. Is the DH Center has this humanities orientation, and so potentially we're less interested in bar graphs. Maybe word clouds might be interesting, but that's going to feel a little matrixy. Thinking about creative ways in which the actual visualization of the data itself is part of the creative work, as opposed to simply the delivery mechanism or something like that.
Yeah. So, and then we also have, another other possibilities for guests going forward. I mean, we don't have to get everybody at the same time. Folks like Cheryl and Doug from Kairos, and I got a couple ideas about once I'm ready to, move from data collection to processing it, making sure what I'm doing makes sense and isn't, totally out of line. So,
yeah.
So that I think is a good sort of to do. We need to talk about updating Manifold. I need to post the methodology, and we need to look at guests. That looks like a good list.
Do we also, because I've got, when I read through the Standish book on the Turk, do we want to start potentially cobbling together a kind of history document where we might plug in some of the things that we've discussed today a little bit? Or we could even hold off on that, but I wonder if in one of these pieces, or perhaps in all of them, something like that might be useful. So, and maybe separate from methodology, but a kind of history of the Turk or the work of the metaphor, something like that, right? That might be useful for the content analysis article if we have some section at least briefly traces the work that right? Why Amazon picks the mechanic, like what's that name do for them? So, right, doing the content analysis, we start with the first bit of discourse, which is the name that Amazon's given us, and a brief history of that and the ways in which it's potentially spun off. So that maybe some of that background work that we've done that's just kind of interesting and helps us think through it might be, and I mean, again, going back to your thing, right? What's an interesting, cool way of presenting this, right? Is there an interesting narrative we can build into a piece that's ostensibly content analysis, but if there's a kind of narrative we can make it a part of, could be potentially interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as if nothing else, contextual information about what this is and why it matters.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I can have added that to the list here.
And I can. Sorry. And I can type up. I've got some notes I can type up and plug into that, so I can add that to my to-do list too. So.
Yeah, and we can potentially split that off as a separate document. Which
it might even just going forward on the project page, imagining people coming to the site. If we have a separate resource that's just a history of the Mechanical Turk, might be useful for people, wanting to get up to speed or that might be less familiar with it. So right now we kind of gesture to it. We have the picture of it, but potentially our own kind of in-house summary or history of it might be useful in a product we produce, but also maybe just to, might make the site more useful for people that come to it.
Yeah. Yeah, it could probably be here as a text, I would think. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, we're getting up there. Anything else right now?
No, I think that's it. That kind of covers what I wanted to get at. So.
Yeah, me too.
But yeah, hopefully we'll have a guest in 2 weeks. I might send a follow-up. So. And
that's something too. We're thinking keeping the sort of regular time Thursdays at 11 as every other Thursday at 11. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
That works for me.
Okay. All right, sounds good. Let me swap over to Skype. Oh, really close up. All right, well then we will keep in touch. Oh yeah, and just folks who may be watching, if you have any interest in participating in the project, you can of course feel free to contact us. Usually our emails here are on the site, so that's probably the best way to get in contact with us. Nathaniel also has a Twitter feed that works. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm intentionally off a lot of social media.
That's probably best for everybody.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's it then. All right.
Okay.
I will see you.
All right. Later.
Later.